Above him, the sky was on fire. Artillery shells and distant aerial dogfights lit up the night like fireflies as the world below them was torn asunder. It was complete and utter chaos. There were no battle lines, no coherent orders, only death, only war. Ivar was still amazed at where he had found himself. He felt the grip of the morning star in his hand. It had a perfect weight and balance, and its dull golden spikes caught the light of the last vestiges of sun, peeking through the heavy smoke clouds above. It was a beautiful weapon. "Vincent," he heard, "you and I have unfinished business." A massive hobgoblin strode towards him, wielding a gigantic, double-bladed greatsword. His armor was adorned with many macabre trophies and malefic runes painted in blood. The Khan leveled his massive sword at Ivar, challenging him to single combat in the midst of the carnage around them. Ivar readied himself, preparing to charge into the fray, but then he realized something. His skin was not his own, nor was the armor that he was wearing. They belonged to someone who he had heard of before, someone who was gone, someone who had died many decades ago. All right, that's the setup. Let's get into Campaign Diary 3. So let's start with some context. Ivar, the party's warlock, recently forsook his pact weapon, casting into space, seemingly ridding himself of it forever. So he's been without a pact weapon for a little while now, and being a Hexblade warlock, and in terms of our agreement and the logic of the world, that ostensibly meant that he had no access to any of his class features or abilities. So he was basically just a really low-level fighter with a high proficiency bonus, some skill proficiencies, and a lot more hit points. So he was having a hard time. And since the group is now level 12, the combats have been pretty rough recently. And being in that position has not made anything easier. The group is aligned with a faction called the Marshals, who are basically these space cowboys who operate on the outer rim of the known universe, or the known galaxy. They are basically a semi-religious organization that has their roots in this deity being called the Angel of the Outer Rim. More recently, Ivar made efforts to reach out to the Angel in the wake of him forsaking his pact weapon, along with taking a few paladin levels. So after coming into contact with the Angel of the Outer Rim in a previous session, she basically sent him across the stars to the location of an important battle that the Marshals fought many decades before the start of the campaign. It's kind of a historical event in the Outer Rim. In this historical event, there's a duel between two figures, the Khan of the War Horde and St. Vincent, basically the leader of the Marshals at the time. Upon exploring the ruins of this battle, Ivar finds a weapon in the ground. He picks it up, wrenches it from the earth, and suddenly he's thrust back in time to this battle. And basically the premise is that he's playing out the battle as it happened. This is where a lot of the session was focused, in the duel itself. And the mechanics behind it were inspired by a Reddit post that I found after doing some research on the internet as to how you would do this, because this is kind of just such an unorthodox thing in D&D. I added some of my own modifications to the system that mainly I felt were justified, mainly because I wanted to, because it's my game and I can do whatever the fuck I want. And I felt they were narratively justified as well, and they catered more to our style of play. But if I'm being completely honest, what ended up happening was I forgot all of the main system I forgot most of everything in that Reddit post, except for like the meta currency itself of the duel point, and I only remembered what I had written down. So I think that it turned out fine. So I don't really regret it, if I'm being honest. In the planning stages of this combat, I wanted to make a custom like stat block for Saint Vincent. I wanted Kai to embody this character so fully to the point where I would give him a new stat block and he could play that. The long and short of it is that that idea just didn't really pan out. I was having a lot of trouble like conceptualizing what the stat block should look like, what design elements would go into it, and also I figured Ivar and St. Vincent are similar enough both in terms of their personality and like their characterization within the story thus far that I felt like it would make just as much sense to just say, Kai, Ivar has all of his abilities back, go nuts. So that's what we ended up doing, and I had to scrap that idea ultimately. If we're talking about what happened in practice with this format, was it resulted from what turned out to be a very fun, very cool, interesting battle, but it was also very short. I think the session ran for maybe like an hour and a half, maybe a little more, but yeah, it did not run for very long at all. One of the biggest impacts on the battle was that we re-rolled initiative every round. So that made it really dynamic and really fun and suspenseful every time the round ended. Because if you had a really good turn and you were going second, it's possible that if you were able to beat the other person in initiative, then you can continue that momentum into the next turn, which could potentially decide the battle if you roll well enough and you make the right plays. At one point during the battle, I had the Khan use a villain action to call in a bunch of minions. Basically, well, they weren't like minions within the stat block sense of the word. They were just like the bog standard hobgoblins from the monster manual. And, you know, Kai's a level 12 PC at this point. Those guys are nothing to him. Like both from like their attack bonuses and the amount of damage they do and their hit points, they're just pushovers. But the point was mainly to take up space and kind of overwhelm him. But in practice, what ended up happening was because Kai is a very smart player, he just ignored them because his armor class was high enough and they didn't do barely any damage and they didn't really pose a challenge for him in terms of positioning. So he was just free to ignore them at will. So if I were to do that again, I just don't think I would. Even though it was still a very dramatic battle, I think that having the minions come in perhaps took a little bit away from the moment. Because it's mainly supposed to be this point of contention between these two mythic figures. In bringing in these little guys who nobody gives a fuck about, I think it took away from the drama a lot. At a few random points throughout the battle, though, I had this one recurring little narrative moment occur. A fight from the surrounding battle, the surrounding carnage of the moment, spill out into the battle map of where this duel is taking place. And that moment was a hobgoblin soldier is basically about to kill like a marshal's deputy or something. The marshal's deputy's on the ropes, and basically they'll die at the end of the turn if Kai doesn't do anything about it, or if Ivar doesn't do anything about it. It was basically just a little thing to make him, have the choice. Like, would his character prioritize the duel, or would he try his best to save the life of the marshal who he knows his character is sworn to protect by this point? The group are trying to be the good guys now. So what does that mean in this moment? What does that mean to Ivar? What's he going to do? So as a reward for saving the marshal, I gave him a choice between either 2d10 plus 5 temporary hit points or a duel point. This system turned out to work pretty well. It was pretty fun to see play out narratively, as he would often have to go out of his way and take a few op attacks, even one from the Khan, who hit a lot harder than the hobgoblins did, just to save this one little guy. It did a pretty good job of incentivizing him as well, because that he could really use that duel point for a lot of different things to pull off some pretty big plays. So I'd say it worked out pretty well. When looking at the whole duel point system, like as a whole, mechanically it's solid, but there are some pretty notable flaws. One thing is that it doesn't last very long at all. When session planning, you can't really count on a system like this to take up a significant amount of game time, as it's two characters. Their turns are going to go by pretty fast, especially like by this point in the campaign, Kai knew his character inside and out. So he knew what he was going to do within maybe like 10 or 15 seconds, probably less. I had constructed the con stat block to be relatively simple, so I knew what I was going to do as well. So it ended up going by very quickly, which I suppose is a double-edged sword. So while Kai and Ivar were the focal points of the battle, and that was the point, is to put the spotlight on them, the other players were kind of left to just watch. I had spoken to them about this before the game started, and I had told them to bear with me, kind of just trust the process, and let the moment breathe, which they all did. They all did that very well. They were good spectators, they cheered him on, they were hyped during the game, but they were left to kind of just sit there and twiddle their thumbs. And there is a part of me from a design, like DM's perspective, that goes like, oh, I wish that I could have found a way for them to be involved, because we're here to play this game together. So I don't really know. I tried thinking of something like earlier on about what I could do to involve them, but as the moment approached, I couldn't really come up with anything that didn't seem half-assed, and I didn't want this moment to be half-assed. I wanted it to stand on its own as one of the epic moments that we're going to remember years down the line from the campaign. Yeah, I just couldn't really see in the moment like a good way to get everybody involved. So I think some more design work is going to have to go in to finding something for them to do. This is kind of a personal problem, and not so much of like a mechanical gripe overall, but in terms of like the design of the con, I tried to implement some concepts from action-oriented design, from Matt Colville. There will be a link. I think I did that, but I did that having balanced it for a larger encounter with more than just one PC. A lot of the abilities that he had, while they were cool, they weren't really suited for this format. I don't think I really succeeded in that regard, but honestly, like I think from like the characterization of his attacks to the amount of damage he was putting up, and just to like his overall presence on the battlefield in that moment, I think that was enough to carry it. But going back in, if I were to do that again, I would probably take more care as to remember, like, this is a one-on-one fight. So the abilities are going to have to be tailored for that in the narrative involved there within. Jumping out of the mechanics and the nitty-gritty stuff, in terms of what happened narratively, Ivar was able to strike a killing blow on the Khan at one point, and he fell to his knees. But in a surprising move, the Khan raised his greatsword above his head, didn't strike at Ivar, struck at his own left hand, cut it off, severed it right at the forearm, about here. Then he reached into a side pouch and produced a gnarled, mummified hand from it. In a cry of fury, he slams the hand onto the stump of his arm, and in a flash of green, malefic arcane energy, the hand attached itself to his body and seemed to give him new life. Mechanically, what happened was he regained all of his hit points and gained some new abilities alongside that. Some people might know what they are. With these new abilities and having regained all of his hit points, the Khan was easily able to kill Ivar, or St. Vincent, in this moment. This was supposed to happen. This was the outcome, arguably from the very beginning. I had prepared scenarios for if Kai were to fail the duel, or if he were to be reduced to 0 hit points first, or if the Khan was reduced to 0 hit points first. And the latter was what ended up happening. I'm glad it ended up that way, because that is significantly more dramatic. To have this like bounce back moment seemingly from out of nowhere, it definitely lends to the menace of this character. It speaks to what he's willing to do to win. This is kind of a railroady moment, which has been kind of rare in this campaign to have a railroad this much. But I think it was justified in that it was telegraphed from fairly early on that this is a historical event taking place that occurred within the campaign decades ago. Both of these characters, the Khan and St. Vincent, are dead by now. The only thing that we're really doing at this time is we're fleshing out exactly what happened. Kind of like, now that I speak about it, kind of like Exandria Unlimited Calamity, but except on a much smaller scale. I don't particularly feel bad about it, personally, because I can mainly tell that Kai had a really good time. And that was the point from the outset. Because he also knew it wasn't his character that was going to die. What happened next after St. Vincent was killed, time slowed down, kind of like faded into this like fugue mirage kind of state. Is the only thing that was like the focal point of the scene was St. Vincent's body in this space. Ivar regained control of his own body and kind of walked over to St. Vincent's fallen corpse, and suddenly St. Vincent began to speak to Ivar from beyond the grave. What ended up happening was they ended up talking about a myriad of things, like the situation at hand and like what's happening in the campaign. And basically one thing that I wanted Vincent to talk about was like fear and his relationship with it. I can't remember exactly what he said in that moment, but it was like throughout all of this, throughout this whole battle, throughout like all the things that have been happening in my life, I've always been incredibly afraid. But fear is the first step on the path towards bravery. And that's kind of what I wanted this arc to be about, or wanted St. Vincent's philosophy to be. And I think what happened was a really, really interesting scene that played out. It was basically St. Vincent passing the torch to Ivar, and giving him a sick new magic item, new patron, and basically Ivar accepted, and baby's got his swagger back. From there, we did a hard cut to Sonya, another PC, looking around the town for Ivar as he just disappeared with this random woman, and she finds him with his back down in the mud of this crowded street. People are just walking around him, and he's kind of just lying there. Sonya notices Ivar's new weapon, a golden morning star called Justice. During her downtime, or when Sonya was away from the campaign, as described in the previous video, she did a quest to go find various Marshall's relics that had been displaced throughout the galaxy. And the last one that she was not able to get was Justice. And seeing Ivar with it slung at his hip was a really fun interaction to see between the two of them. After that, the crew set off towards the town hall of Stormvale to discuss with the factions who were there what their next move was, because the Rothian ship is still in the sky. They beat the ground force that was coming to invade the city. They were able to repel them. Some of the group's other allies were able to temporarily disable the Rothian ship, but they have not destroyed it. So the threat is still there, and they need to convene with their allies, in some cases, as to what their next moves are going to be. And that's where we left it. I really loved that session. I had I've had this idea in my head for over a year, I think. Around a year, somewhere like that. And to see it come to fruition was really satisfying for me. And to see that Ivar and Kai had a fun time with it makes it even more satisfactory to me. Would I use this system again? I don't know. Maybe if it ever came up again. It's a very niche moment within the story, and it's probably one of my favorites that's ever happened. Both from Kai's characterization in those moments in the battle, to the setting in which it took place, to everything that surrounded it. It's a historical moment within the group setting. So I was just really excited to see it pan out. And yeah, I don't know. We'll see. So yeah, that's it for this one. It's been a while since we played. One of our players is on a big exchange trip throughout Europe and Asia, and he doesn't get back for a little while. So I don't know when the next campaign diary is going to be, but I have some other videos in the pipe that should be fun, and hopefully I'll get back to it soon. All right, thank you so much. Bye. Take care.